Have you ever been completely exhausted by a decision that nobody else even knew you are struggling with? You haven't had an argument with anyone. Nobody has attacked you. Nothing dramatic has happened. And yet, internally, you're having a full-blown debate. One part of you says, go for it. Another part says, what if it doesn't work? One says, you deserve better. Another says, maybe you're expecting too much. One says, you need to rest. Another says, you don't have time to rest. And here is what is fascinating. From the outside, you may look completely fine. You're answering emails. You're leading meetings. You're taking care of your family. You're making decisions. You're showing up. You're smiling, like I'm smiling now. Performing. But internally, there is a war nobody else can see. And that may explain something you have been struggling with to understand. Why you are exhausted when your workload doesn't seem unusually heavy. Why simple decisions feel complicated. Why you keep changing your mind. Why you procrastinate on things you genuinely care about. Why you can give brilliant advice to other people, but you struggle to follow your own. Today, I want to talk to you about the internal conflict you cannot see. Because some of the greatest sources of overwhelm aren't on your calendar. They're happening inside your own system. And until you recognize them, you'll keep trying to solve an internal problem with an external solution. So let's get into it. Let's start with a simple idea. You can want two things that contradict each other at the same time. You can want success and fear what success will demand from you. You can want intimacy and fear vulnerability. You can want freedom and crave certainty. You can want recognition and dislike being seen. You can want change and desperately want things to remain familiar. None of this makes you irrational. It makes you human. But here is where the problem begins. When these competing desires remain unresolved, they create internal friction. Think about driving a car with the wheels slightly out of alignment. The car still moves, the engine still works, you can still reach your destination, but you are constantly making corrections. And the vehicle is working harder than it should. That is what internal conflict does. It doesn't necessarily stop you. It makes everything more expensive, more mental energy, more emotional energy, more hesitation, more second guessing, and more recovery time. And high capacity individuals can be particularly vulnerable because they're often capable of compensating for internal friction. They can push through. They can perform. They can meet the deadline. They can solve the problem. So everyone assumes they are fine. Everyone assumes they are fine. Sometimes they assume they are fine too, until the cost becomes impossible to ignore. The cost becomes impossible to ignore. Now, let's go deeper. One of the most powerful forms of internal conflict is the gap between who you are and who you believe you should be. Think about how many shoulds we carry. I should be further ahead. I should be more successful. I should be more patient. I should be able to handle this. I should say yes. I should want this opportunity. I should be happier. I should be stronger. And eventually, should becomes a very loud voice. And here is the problem. The person you think should be may not be the person you actually need to become. You have inherited an identity from your family, from your profession, from your culture, from your peers, from your previous successes, or even from a version of yourself that existed 10 years ago. And now, you're trying to build today's life using yesterday's identity. That is exhausting. Think about Tony Stark. His greatest challenge wasn't whether he could build another machine. It was figuring out who he was beneath the armor. The external capacity was never the biggest question. The biggest question was the internal identity. And many high performers face the same tension. They are incredibly capable, but they are still operating from identity built around proving themselves. So they achieve again, and then achieve again. And somehow, the achievement never quite settles the internal question. Am I enough? That's not a productivity problem. That is an identity conflict. There is another conflict I see frequently. You say one thing matters, but your life consistently rewards something else. You say family matters, but your calendar says work matters more. You say health matters, but your schedule leaves no room for recovery. You say peace matters, but you continually accept environments that disturb it. You say purpose matters, but most of your energy goes towards maintaining appearances. Now, I'm not saying this to create guilt. No, not at all. I'm saying it because this gap creates friction. When your stated values and lived priorities consistently disagree, your internal system notices. You may not consciously articulate it, but something inside you knows. The life I'm living doesn't complete the life I say I value. And that contradiction consumes energy. That is why someone can be incredibly productive and still feel strangely unfulfilled. They are not necessarily doing little. They may be doing a lot of the wrong things for the wrong reasons. That is why alignment matters before optimization. You can optimize a life that isn't aligned. You can become extremely efficient at moving in the wrong direction. And efficiency doesn't make misalignment less expensive. No. It makes you reach the wrong destination faster. Imagine that, reaching the wrong destination faster. And here is one that high performers often understand only after they have been carrying it for years. The conflict between what you feel and what you allow yourself to acknowledge. For example, you may be angry, but you tell yourself, you shouldn't be angry. You are disappointed, but you tell yourself to be grateful. You are exhausted, but you tell yourself, push harder. You are hurt, but you tell yourself, you are over it. You are afraid, but you tell yourself, you're supposed to be confident. So, you do what high capacity people are very good at doing. You override yourself. And sometimes that is necessary temporarily. There are moments when you have to perform despite how you feel. But if overriding yourself becomes your permanent strategy, eventually your emotional system starts sending stronger signals in the form of irritability, withdrawal, overreaction, numbness, anxiety, loss of motivation, decision fatigue. And then you ask, what is wrong with me? Perhaps nothing is wrong with you. Perhaps something inside you has been trying to get your attention. That is an important distinction in my internal coherence recalibration model. The goal isn't to obey every emotion, no. And it isn't to suppress every emotion. It is to understand what that emotion is communicating and determine how it fits in the larger internal system. Emotional stability isn't the absence of emotion. It is the ability to experience emotion without allowing internal conflict to control your life. That is what it means. So, how do you actually find a conflict you cannot see? How do you find it? You start asking better questions. Not, why am I so consistent? But instead ask, what am I trying to accomplish while another part of me is trying to protect me from something? Don't ask, why can't I make this decision? Instead you should ask, what competing priorities are making this decision difficult? Then you don't ask, why am I so overwhelmed? But instead ask, what am I carrying that has never been properly processed, prioritized, or released? And don't ask, why can't I just be disciplined? But instead ask, what would make disciplined action feel internally congruent? This is where recalibration begins. Within my internal coherence recalibration model, I examine the relationship between several dimensions of a person's internal system. These are values, what genuinely matters. Then identity, what do you believe, who do you believe you are? Then I look at emotions, what are you experiencing and what needs to be processed? Then I look at priorities, what deserves your attention right now? Then I look at your behaviors, what are your actions actually reinforcing? The goal is to identify the major contradictions that are draining your capacity. Because once the conflict becomes visible, you can work with it. You can make a conscious decision. You can redefine a priority. You can process an emotion. You can challenge an outdated belief. You can release an identity that no longer fits. You can change a behavior that contradicts your values. And that is recalibration. Let me leave you with this. You may not be lazy. You may not be undisciplined. You may not lack ambition. You may not have a motivation problem. You may simply have too many competing internal signals. And when these signals aren't coordinated, life becomes exhausting. Imagine an orchestra where every musician is highly talented. The problem isn't talent. The problem is that they are not playing the same piece. Give them a shared score. Give them a common rhythm. Give them direction. And suddenly the same musicians create something completely different. That is what internal coherence does. It doesn't give you a new personality. No. It doesn't remove every difficult emotion. It doesn't make every decision obvious. It creates internal agreement. And when internal agreement increases, decision making becomes clearer. Emotional stability becomes stronger. Consistency becomes easier. Every energy becomes available. And you stop spending so much of your life negotiating with yourself. That is the transformation I'm interested in. Not helping high capacity individuals become machines that can tolerate more pressure. No. But helping them become more internally coherent, enough to use their capacity without constantly fighting themselves. So, the next time you feel stuck, don't immediately ask, what is wrong with me? Instead ask, what competing parts of my internal system are pulling me in different directions? That question can open a completely different door. Because sometimes the breakthrough isn't about finding more motivation. It is about resolving the conflict that has been quietly consuming your motivation all along. If this message resonated with you, comment here below with the word coherence and tell me, where do you experience the greatest internal conflict right now? Is it your identity, your priorities, your emotions, your values, or your decisions? If you are ready to escape overwhelm, restore emotional stability, and develop decision clarity through the internal coherence recalibration model, subscribe to the channel. Because the goal isn't to silence every voice inside you. It is to help the right voices work together. And when your internal system finally starts working together, you don't just think differently, you live differently.